A couple of weeks ago, I of course put out a video about my favourite cars in Gran Turismo, and more importantly, I asked in the comments for you folks of the community to tell me what your favourite was. Could be one, could be more, and many of you did put a full top 10 or top 5 and some even more. And that was great to see. Hundreds of comments, about 6,000 people viewed the video, which of course is a tiny sample size of the Gran Turismo community as a whole, and thanks to YouTube's utterly garbage algorithm, that's a small sample size of this community, let alone the Gran Turismo one. Some of them were definitely expected, and from what I could see there were probably about maybe 4 or 5 cars that seemed to pop up the most, and most of them probably aren't going to surprise you, but then there were some which actually kind of shocked me in terms of how I kept seeing these cars pop up. Now, much as with my own list, I'm not going to put this one into any kind of order because that would be ridiculous, and of course in future people could add more comments or like certain comments, so it would immediately be inaccurate anyway, but I'm going to try and run through all of the primary ones, and of course there's no way I can put in footage of every single one because the video would probably just crash in the editing software, but let's just work in any particular order. First things first, this is one of probably the 2 vehicles which I saw mentioned the most. Number 1, the Mazda 787B. I mean, to the surprise of no one probably, of course, it's so iconic, it's massively popular, it's the kind of car where as soon as it comes on the scene, it immediately makes an impression. For those who already knew about the car before Gran Turismo, then of course you'll have probably wanted to see it in the game, and for those who found out about it because of Gran Turismo, which of course was the case for me as a kid and certainly for my dad, my old man would have loved to have seen how many people put that car because it was his favourite car in real life and in the game, and it was certainly because of the game because he'd never heard of it before either. The second one, which was the most common I saw in the comments and certainly in terms of likes and support and discussion about it, also won't surprise you, it's kind of like the road car version of the 787B in terms of being just consistently brilliant, in fact in its own way even more OP, the Tomicaira. Of course the Tomicaira ZZ2, massive levels of support for that car, which was fantastic to see, and of course I get it, it's a ridiculously OP machine, and it wouldn't surprise me if it came back. If it did, it might be one of the only road cars which could be about as OP as the Aston Martin Valkyrie is now in Gran Turismo 7. But with those 2 primary ones out of the way first, let's run through the rest of the ones which I saw pop up again and again. And just for the sake of housekeeping, I am putting a few of these together because otherwise you'll get into like different liveries and different racing numbers and different particular years, and that just gets ridiculous. So some of them will be grouped. First things first, the Zonda. The Pagani Zonda is one which came up a number of different times, C12S, Zonda R, Zonda LM race car. The LM race car came up a fair few times, that was great for me to see. I always loved that car as a kid as well. Next one was the Alpha 155. This one also doesn't surprise me, of course, hugely nostalgic, back in Gran Turismo 2, then I seem to recall it wasn't in number 3, I can't remember now, maybe it was. It was of course in Gran Turismo 4 and onward, and now we finally have it back in that full premium HD form. Next up, the Celine S7. This was a lovely one to see. I could have easily seen this car falling between the cracks, but it didn't. I almost had this one on my own list. It is legitimately one of my favourite supercars in real life. Some would even say the first true American supercar. That's arguable, but it's certainly one of the best. So that was fantastic to see, and such a capable car as well. The next one is one of the cars that I'm going to have to group together because there are so many different versions mentioned. The Dodge Viper. Of course, super iconic car, easily one of the most iconic cars of the whole series. In particular, I saw a lot of people mentioning 2, in fact no, 3 Vipers in particular. The 1996 Viper GTS, especially from the older games, and for sure, yeah, very iconic car, another favourite of my dad's back in the day. The Team Orica Viper, which technically means there are a couple of different ones. My favourite one was the Gran Turismo 2 in the blue and white. Of course, later we had the, green tinted lights with the red and white, super iconic as well, and also a fair amount of love for the Viper ACR as well, which also makes sense because, much like the Tomicaira, ridiculously OP road car. Next up is one which I did not expect to see at all, let alone be mentioned by multiple people, the Volvo 240 wagon. I don't know if this is a meme, but there's a couple of cars like this on the list, which I'm so happy to see. Of course, we all have those obvious picks, but stuff like this, it just puts a smile on my face. Of course, yeah, super iconic car in real life for Volvo, and I can't say I used it a huge amount myself, but it certainly was a car that did have potential. Another one which, speaking of wagons, really surprised me, but in a pretty cool way, because I don't recall people really chattering that much about it when I reviewed it years and years ago on the channel, but I guess the channel was a lot smaller then. The Subaru wagon, the Impreza WRX wagon. I get it, you know, it's a fantastic machine anyway. In every form, the Subaru is a strong car, but the wagon, it's just that bit more unique, a bit more interesting. It stands out more, kind of like the 22B. So that was cool to see. A number of people did mention that one. Another one which isn't surprising at all. Unfortunately, we probably won't see it back, which is a real shame for obvious reasons, because it burned to the ground. The Mazda Furai, one of the very few cars in Gran Turismo 6 which could genuinely take on stuff like the FXX and the Tommy Kaira and be that level of just ballistic missile. Of course, lovely for having the rotary engine aspect, kind of like a supercar meets a race car, somewhere in between. Yeah, I don't see it coming back because of the real car not existing anymore, but yeah, that one doesn't surprise me to see. Another one which I'm going to have to group together because it did feature road and race and LM and touring car and all these different versions, even the Tavon Trampio version from Gran Turismo 2, of course, the Mitsubishi FTO. Another one of my old man's favourites. It seems like he had a lot of popular picks. Yeah, fantastic car. One of the best front-wheel drive chassis coupes. Certainly one of the best looking front-wheel drive coupes in my opinion as well. The next one is the Toyota 86. Again, number of different forms, we'll kind of bunch them together. Some people love the race modify version, that kind of a JGTC style car from Gran Turismo 2. Some people just the road going version, the Sprinter Truno. But of course, super iconic car from Initial D, from Gran Turismo, and from real life. Just a brilliant little mix of just the right amount of power, great drift potential, great looks, and not too crazy, I guess, on prices. I mean, they're a bit expensive for what they are, but not as crazy as some other JDM cars at least. The next one showed up consistently for so many different people, a couple of different variations of the same idea, but as a general sense, the Ford GT LM. Some said the Spec 2, some said the more Golf liveried version, some said the more updated, like test car version of the newer game, I believe. And of course, this will bleed over into a certain other Ford model as well, which has its heritage tied intrinsically with the GT LM, but for now, of course, this one was going to appear. And for those like myself who grew up absolutely loving Gran Turismo 4, it's, of course, a childhood hero car. The next two, again in no particular order, are both like duh moments, because of course they're both going to be here. In fact, you're probably surprised I haven't said them already. Some of you might have even thought these were the two most popular ones I was going to say. Number one, of course, the Escudo. I mean, would it ever not be on people's favourite Gran Turismo lists? I've always been more of a Suzuki cultist kind of guy because I like the less obvious pick, but of course the Escudo is always going to be on like favourite list, most iconic car list. It's just that level of machine. Craziest cars, fastest cars. The Escudo kind of ticks every single box as you go down them. Likewise with the next one, the Toyota GT1. I feel like people are talking about it more now that it's back especially, but it was such a long-standing tradition almost. It's just one of those cars that you expect to be in Gran Turismo, and it's more weird when it isn't in there, which is one of the reasons why I kept talking about it being so obvious to bring back. And now that they have, it's as OP as you'd expect it to be in Group 2. Another one which is a relatively recent pick, more like the latter half of the franchise, but of course people adore it in real life. It's many people's favourite sounding car. Clarkson, I believe, said it was his favourite car he'd ever driven. Of course, I'm referring to the Toyota Supercar, the Lexus LFA. Of course, absolutely adored machine from so many different people. I feel like this is the car that actually lived up to the hype in terms of coming back in Gran Turismo 7, whereas the C8 Stingray, the Corvette, didn't quite match up to what I think people were expecting it to be. I don't really see that many people or hear that many people talking about it or using it. I feel like the Corvette disappointed some people, which I kind of predicted. The LFA, on the other hand, you already know what you get. The next one, much like the 787B, is an iconic car, and the GT1 for that matter. In fact, it's the iconic trio between the three. This one I do think has a very, very good chance of coming back, and personally, I'm really keen to see what happens if it does, because the Toyota is wildly different now compared to what it used to be in terms of where it sits in the rankings and the podium and the classes. This one, I think, would actually be a better car if it were to come back now than maybe it ever was before. But I am, of course, talking about the undoubtedly also Group 2 Nissan R390. wildly OP in Gran Turismo 3 in particular, and the R390 was one of those cars which was very quickly kind of kicked to the wayside once Gran Turismo 4, for example, came around, and then so many new kids on the block arrived, like the Bentley and the Pescarolo and the Sauber, and just completely blew the Nissan out of the water. But in GT3, that thing was the GOAT. It was the one to beat. So quick, in fact, that even around the test course, if you were in like a Formula car, you'd still struggle to keep up with that thing. The next one is another car that I'm going to have to group together because so many people mention so many different variants of it. Another one which isn't too surprising, and a number of JDM cars do consistently show up here, the Honda S2000. From the GT1 to the LM to, aftermarket tuner versions to road versions, it's such a popular car. And to go back to what I mentioned just now with the new kids on the block, that is of course one of them, the Bentley Speed 8. This is another car which, much like the GT1, I think really does deserve to come back. The Bentley is a gorgeous machine. It was already a premium, so you're 9/10 of the way there. Such a stunning looking car in that immediately recognisable green. Of course, it got Bentley the victory, and sure, it's based on the Audi R8 underneath, but who cares? It's way better looking, it's way more interesting, and the fact that Bentley came back after dominating Le Mans in the early days and then doing so again in 2003, it was just cool, and it's a fantastic car in the game. The next one was another one of those cars which I understand, but I wouldn't have thought it would have appeared consistently through so many different comments. The Mercedes CLK DTM, or as it's called in the game, the CLK touring car. Another one of my old man's favourites. He used to find this thing to have such good handling and be so nicely balanced. Every single time he was in a touring car event in like Gran Turismo, I think it was 3, 4, he would always use the CLK when he could. The Vauxhalls and the Opals and the Alfa Romeo, they were fine, but the Mercedes was just such a consistent, brilliant all-rounder, plus it looks fantastic as well. The next one is one of a couple of different HKS models that were featured and mentioned a few times. This one I think does have a good chance of coming back. In fact, it's going to feature in a Gran Turismo 6 review in future about just that. The CT230R, aka the HKS Time Attack Evo. Of course, Forza's had it, Gran Turismo's had it. I feel like it's one of those cars where people might overhype it just a little bit, because yeah, it is very quick, but time has moved on, and you can kind of build your own cars that are just as quick, for example, around like Tsukuba. But sure, yeah, it's quick, it's like the ultimate Evo kind of thing. But speaking of real-life dream cars, this one seemed to be mentioned pretty synonymously in that kind of context here. Not only a car that people love in the game, but also that they love to own in real life, the Buick Grand National, the GNX. Another car which I must admit I didn't use anywhere near as much as many people. I was always more of a Buick Special kind of guy, which is technically the Buick Skylark in a custom car form. So much love. And of course, such an iconic car. Yeah, very capable car as well. And a lot lighter than many other muscle cars, which was a key advantage to it. The next one popped up a few times for a few different people, the Ferrari F2007. Of course, Formula 1 is always something which many players want more of in Gran Turismo. Mostly, I would assume, licensing holds it back. It's unfortunate, but that's kind of how it goes. That's how you end up with stuff like the Polyphony 001s and the various other versions of Gran Turismo 3 that had different fictional Formula cars, or probably most famously the Polyphony Formula Gran Turismo, which was a brilliant machine, and occasionally we get the real stuff like Mercedes more recently, and of course this one. So yeah, that one doesn't surprise me that it would be in there. Another one that I'm going to have to group together like the FTO is the Toyota MR2, be it road versions, racing versions, aftermarket tuned versions. There's also, like the S2000, so much to choose from. With so many different generations, the MR2 is a consistently very strong choice, be it the old school supercharged, really boxy version, be it the mini Ferrari F355 of the 90s, which so many people love, or be it some of the, again, JGTC kind of style racing machines from Gran Turismo 2. There's kind of something for everyone. Another one which I was really happy to see, because even though I don't think I had it on my list, it is actually my favourite Mercedes, in real life that is, and legitimately in my top 5 dream car garage, the SLR McLaren. Some people, I think, might have mixed memories on the SLR because of the notorious Mission 34 in Gran Turismo 4, but I've always loved the SLR. It's a gorgeous car. It's a bit heavy, and it's not as quick by today's standards. It's got me written all over it. Speaking of Mercedes, though, another one which popped up a number of times, again to the surprise of no one, as with the Alfa 155, the 190E. Of course, road version is iconic, touring car version even more so. I mean, it goes without saying, of course, so many people love the 190E. The next one was another fascinating fascinating one to me because I didn't realise there was so much love for this one. The Subaru LM race car. And I'm not, of course, talking about the Speed 12, again from way back in the early days of Gran Turismo, such an OP car that I must admit I didn't really use that much. The next one wasn't as frequent, but definitely deserves a mention because it's so iconic and was mentioned enough times for it to be here. The Vertigo. The Gillett Vertigo, a strangely OP car that came out of nowhere with a stupid amount of power and the wacky looks. Almost felt kind of like an alternative to the Panos from a certain perspective, but yeah, pretty wild little car, and much like brands such as Spiker and Celine and Callaway, a bit undervalued for the most part. The next one, I'm not going to dwell on it for too long because I already talked about it, the Buick Special. The GNX, of course, we talked about. This one was one of my favourite cars in GT4 because it was so cheap, and yeah, stunning looking car, proper lowrider vibes. Another one which consistently kept showing up. Some people refer to it as the concept car, some people refer to it as its actual name, the Copperhead, the Dodge concept car from Gran Turismo's earlier days. This one was always a fascinating one to me. I didn't really use it that much, but it was a pretty cool looking thing, kind of like a mini Viper, like a Honda S2000 meets a Dodge Viper kind of thing. But yeah, that one doesn't surprise me either. It's got the nostalgic feels. The next one, to go back to Tommy Kyra, this one surprises me actually because it was mentioned a number of times. The ZZS. Great little car, but I wouldn't have thought it would have quite as much love as it seems to, which is great to see. Speaking of cars that you're not expecting to see though, this one popped up more times than I was expecting, but I guess at this point I shouldn't be surprised with stuff like the Volvo being here. The Honda Odyssey. And personally, I get it. I love the Odyssey. In Gran Turismo 6, I used it quite a bit. Four-wheel drive, you could tune it up to be deceptively quick, and it's a pretty good-looking minivan as well. The next one was pretty consistent also, the Miura and the Countach. Of course, I'm not going to necessarily bunch them too much together, but most of the people who tend to talk about one would also mention the other, at least as my memory serves. The next one has to be probably the broadest category of putting these all together. GTR. I mean, name one car to kind of just be Gran Turismo in a pure drivable form in real life. The Nissan GTR is exactly that. From R34 and certainly R35, it basically is Gran Turismo with a steering wheel, which I guess is just Gran Turismo still. So it's Gran Turismo with a key, I guess. So yeah, the GTR, of course, from GT500s to road versions, to stealths, to concepts, to prototypes, it's such a Gran Turismo car. And in fact, I guess if you really want to get technical about it, the R35 GTR may be the Gran Turismo car, if you actually refer to just how much real-world inspiration was taken from Gran Turismo and imported into a real production vehicle. The R35 might be the king of that. The next one I saw a bunch of different comments about in a bunch of different forms, the Ferrari 430. The Scuderia, as you'd expect, but also the normal F430 as well. A lot of people seem to have a lot of love for this car. It wasn't overwhelming, but I noticed that it did come up more than once, that's for sure. Another one which came up a few different times was the XJR15. The Jaguar stillborn race car that apparently handled like absolute garbage in real life. Great looking car. Of course, didn't have the longevity of the XJ220 in the franchise, but a very, very cool machine. And of course, probably pretty notably, it's in Forza Horizon 5 as a barn find, and that's a hell of a barn find. The next one was also pretty consistent, the BMW M5. This is also one of the cars that you see the most mentions for people wanting it to come back in GT7, especially the E60 shape with that 5-litre V10 engine. Not much else to say there, it's a pretty obvious one, and so many people still want that car and love it. The next one goes back to the HKS discussion because this one pleasantly surprises me. If you'd have asked me which HKS drag car do you think more people would mention, I would have guessed the R33 Skyline. But actually, most of the people, if not all of the people that I saw mentioning the drag car, referred to the 180SX, which was quite cool to see. This one might or might not be a future special projects build. So for those who love the car, you might want to stick around for that. The next one, of course, doesn't surprise me at all though. Back to the world of racing, one of the most fascinating cars to come from Honda. No road-going version. I think the road-going version would have looked very strange based on how the race car is shaped. Of course, the screaming, super OP Honda HSV10. So many people love this car. For me, I was never quite on the hype train, but then again, I wasn't on the hype train for the LFA at the time either. It would be very, very cool to see this one back, and I feel like if it did come back in presumably Group 2, a lot of people I think would be using this thing. Which kind of shows how broken Group 2 is, because there's no way in hell this thing should be in the same category as a Toyota GT1, but there we are. The next one, to go back to touring cars, and it was actually pretty cool to see how many people love touring cars, was the Calibra. No surprise there, I loved the Calibra as a kid. The Astra also featured on this list as well, because many people mentioned it. I think I did notice more comments for the Calibra though than the Astra, and the four-wheel drive, the older vibe, that more retro kind of Alfa 155 and Mercedes 190e era look to it. Of course, that's going to hit the nostalgia, and it legitimately is a really good car. Sounds pretty damn nice too, if I recall correctly. The next one I'm going to be forced to put into a condensed down version once again. NSX. Honda NSX, what can we say? Super iconic, up there with the GTR and the Supra for sure. So many different variations that people mentioned, from Mugen to Castrol to NSXR road car, so many different versions of an absolutely brilliant platform. As a road car, it's legendary. As a race car, perhaps even more so, and it's a consistently pretty damn good one to say the least. The next one, just like the Castrol, and I guess you could say just like the NSX, the Pennzoil. You just say the word Pennzoil and you immediately have a mental image. A mental image which Gran Turismo 7 knew exactly what it was doing with when they put it in the trailer. That iconic yellow and black R34 GT500 car. Super iconic car, of course, one of the OGs as well. Next up is a car which was quite refreshing to see, because I don't hear people talking about it quite as much as I would have expected, but it seems like this one might be maybe gaining a bit more popularity again in terms of people wanting it back in Gran Turismo. A Mustang in particular, but the SVT Cobra. The Mustang was a deceptively good car, and it's a hell of a thing when you tune it up as well, and it's also a damn good looking car. The next one doesn't surprise me at all. Of course it was going to be on the list. One of the wackiest cars, and probably the only other race car that can actually give the Chaparral a run for its money on being crazy, and unfortunately it was even crazier in one sense than the Chaparral, because this one actually did, if I recall correctly, kill its test driver. The Toyota 7. What an absolutely ballistic machine. Ridiculously lightweight, stupidly powerful, borderline like Minolta levels of power, and even though it wasn't necessarily quite as quick, what an absolute monster of a car with that exposed, I seem to recall, twin turbo back end that you could see hanging out. Awesome looking car, and imagine if this came back now, the kind of liveries you could make on that thing, because it's pretty much already a blank canvas. The next one, of course, I alluded to it earlier on when I talked about the Cerberus. Another car that's like the Viper, like the Escudo, like the GT1. You can't have a favourites or most iconic Gran Turismo list without it being here, and I seem to recall that I had it on my list too. The TVR Speed 12, of course. I mean, such a no-brainer to have the Speed 12, one of the synonyms for ridiculously fast. It's kind of like the Tomahawk before the Tomahawk in a certain sense. The Speed 12 was always stupidly quick in Gran Turismo, and especially the fact that it was mostly a road car, apart from in Gran Turismo 2, made it even more crazy. Speaking of crazy though, and I alluded to this one just now when I talked about the Toyota 7, the Minolta. Of course, the Minolta was going to be on here. I put it in the thumbnail, in fact, of the previous video, because I knew it was going to be here. You can't have a favourites list also from Gran Turismo without having the Minolta, which is fascinating to see because it's also one of those more kind of midpoint cars which came along around Gran Turismo 4 and after, but it immediately made its mark known. It immediately solidified why you should respect this car, why it was such an overwhelmingly powerful, ridiculously fast machine. Some people don't like it, they find it too slippery or too squeamish, whatever. One thing is for sure, if you master it, it's fast as hell, and it will consistently be fast as hell. The next one I kind of mentioned just now when I was talking about the Mustang, the Camaro. Now, a number of different Camaros were mentioned, but the one which actually came up the most seemed to be the LM. The Camaro LM in that kind of 4-colour layout with the tinted lights, that very touring car kind of shape with a white back end, colour over the top. I used to love it in that green with the white back end, huge rear wing, lovely handling on that thing as well, and I always loved the LM way more than the road-going version. The next one, another JDM icon. Not much to say from me personally because I didn't use it that often, but the Honda Prelude. Many people love this car in real life, probably actually more love I see generally speaking in real life than even in Gran Turismo, but I could easily see this being one of those cars that many people have purchased because of playing Gran Turismo, much like with the Skyline, you know, the NSX, whatever else. Speaking of which, the next one falls into the exact same boat, probably even for more people. the S13, the Nissan Silvia. A few different people talked about different Silvias, but the S13 definitely was the one that came up the most. Speaking of the Mazda 787B earlier on, the LM55. To me, this is probably, at least off the top of my head, aside from, I guess, the Tomahawk, but even then probably more so than the Tomahawk, the one Vision GT car, which I think shows and proves, even to someone that doesn't like Vision GTs, that this is what the program is capable of doing when you actually put effort in. Because Mazda didn't just want to use it as a marketing exercise, they wanted to make a car that they knew people would love. You actually get the impression that they cared that players love the 787B so much and love driving their cars in Gran Turismo, and that came through, I think, because the LM55 legitimately is brilliant. You can't have a list like this without the next one coming up. I alluded to it earlier on again. You can't talk about the Pennzoil, you can't talk about the NSXs without this one coming up. Of course, another ultra icon. On the Mount Rushmore, this one would be there as well. It's white, it's red, it's green, and it's got Castrol written on it. It is, of course, the Supra. We technically have it back. Must admit, I'm not a regular user of really any of the GT500 cars, or the GT300s for that matter, but this one, of course, immediately recognisable. There were a few different versions of the Supra that I saw people giving love for, but the Castrol was definitely the most consistent. The next one I was very happy to see. Didn't really surprise me, but it is another one of my favourites, and I said as much, the R92CP. I would always choose this over the Minolta personally, a bit sharper, a bit more twitchy, I guess, whereas the Minolta was a bit more slippery rather than twitchy, but fantastic battles between the two, and both just absolute speed missiles in a straight line. Speaking of speed missiles though, this is one which kind of disappointed me when it first came around to Gran Turismo, a very recent addition for it to be on this list, relatively speaking, the Porsche 962. I mean, imagine if the 962 had been around since Gran Turismo 4. Imagine how stupidly OP it would have been back then, back when Minoltas and stuff had like 1200 horsepower. That's kind of what the 962 deserves. It deserves that kind of ridiculous qualifying trim respect. Unfortunately, we got it in GT Sport, which means it's nowhere near as quick as you'd expect it to be, but it's still a damn good looking car and a super iconic one. And talk about a dominating one. Between the 956 and the 962 Porsche, they made their mark clear in Group C, that's for sure. Next up, another very nice one to see for me, Venturi. And I'm going to have to group this together because a few different people mentioned a few different versions. I'm really happy to see the love for Venturi because it is one of my favourite brands as well from back in the day in Gran Turismo 2. For me, the 400 GT, some people said the 300 Atlantic, some people said the 600 LM, which was a brilliant car. But yeah, it's great to see Venturi getting some love. Another one which won't surprise anyone, and I feel like this is one of those cars where if you're talking about Gran Turismo, if you're talking about Forza, or if you're talking about real life, it will be on many people's top 10s, and for some people probably still their favourite car, McLaren F1. It's a no-brainer. It's kind of a late addition, if you think about it, for Gran Turismo. You'd think they'd have had it even earlier than that, but the first time we saw it was kind of weird. It was in a BMW dealership, and it was the long tail with BMW livery, which of course it's BMW powered, but still it's kind of odd for that to be this car's debut. Seeing that consistent love from the community though, be it road car, be it the Le Mans winning version, be it the long tail, be it even the stealth model I saw love for, that was pretty cool to see across the board. And again, it's kind of an obvious one to go for, because for many people they do still consider it to be the best car ever made. Next up, an iconic rally car, the Lancia Stratos. Be it road car, be it rally car, such an iconic shape, such an iconic rally machine, and right on that pivot point, I guess you could technically say the 037 was where Lancia officially gave up the go on rear-wheel drive rally, but the Stratos was right in that pocket of where it was the thing to do. Rear-wheel drive to its arguable perfection in the form of the Stratos, and such an iconic shape as well, kind of like the Ferrari of the rally world at that time, and for good reason. Next up, we've got more JDM though. Definitely have to group this one together because there are so many different variants that people love. The Toyota Celica, another one which doesn't surprise me at all. The Celica is one of those lineages where if you look from the super old school, which I seem to recall is actually on the leaked list, I think, what was it, the 1973 I think Celica, the one that looks kind of like a mini Mustang, all the way up to the rally version, which we have now, even the ST205, the ST165, which I think is a very undervalued car, ST185. There's, as I said, kind of something for everyone. There's race versions, there's rally versions, there's road versions, there's even aftermarket ones like the Trial Celica. Yeah, that one doesn't surprise me to see a lot of love for. The next one I pretty much already talked about, kind of in there with the other touring cars, the Astra, be it the Opel, be it the Vauxhall. This one I always passed over for the sake of the Calibra. but even I would have to admit it was the quicker of the two. It didn't have the four-wheel drive advantage, but it was definitely a faster machine, and the Astra was pretty much the only other touring car, at least from this DTM group, that could genuinely give the CLK a great run for its money every single time. Unless, of course, you jump after that point and go to stuff like the Red Bull Audis, but that's not entirely fair because they're a bit later. Next up, another newcomer. This one's lovely to see though, because it is a super iconic car, and for good reason. I mean, I would be more surprised to not see love for it. The Porsche 917, one of the most iconic Porsches ever, and even by today's standards, still one of the fastest Porsches ever. Another one which we're going to have to group together because there were various different versions. I most commonly saw love for the DTM, which of course I referred to just now, the Audi TT. Some people said about the TTR touring car. I also love that one. I love the A4 touring car even more, to be honest. And speaking of touring cars, I saw a bit of love for the RS5. Not as much as I would have thought though, but the TT definitely beat the LM, which I still think is a very undervalued car in Gran Turismo 2, to the road version, to the touring car. The TT is a consistent car, and even though I didn't put it on my list, the TT actually does have a special place for me, because back in Gran Turismo 2, I remember the TT Quattro being my favourite car. It wasn't for very long, because I was still new to the game at that point, but it was like the one car that I recognised, so I immediately liked it in the game. Sticking on the theme of Gran Turismo 2 nostalgia though, the next one I really did love, and it's so great to see other people loved it too, the Tigra Ice race car. We had the Tigra later on, but I mean, the road version is not even close to what this thing could do. What was it, like a 400 horsepower car, I think? For me, this one's up there with like the Daihatsu Syrian rally car, which of course I mentioned being one of my favourites. Just that totally unexpected but ballistically quick little thing. And honestly, if I could bring back any Vauxhall, any Opel, even over the touring cars, as sacrilegious as that is to say, it would be this one. Another more recent addition, and to me this tells you that you were probably a Gran Turismo 6 fan, the Pagani Huayra. I mean, anyone who played Gran Turismo 6, and certainly anyone who followed this channel in the early days, you'll know about the Huayra. There was plenty of Huayra content on the channel because it was pretty much the most consistently quick car on Special Stage Route X. And of course, those were most of my tune setups on the channel at that point. Another Le Mans icon, it's here for good reason. It's good to see the love for it because it does deserve that respect. And I feel like it doesn't quite get as much respect in the game as it deserves. The Jaguar XJR9. The XJR15 wasn't exactly a success, but the XJR9 was a Le Mans winner. Super iconic in that silk cut Jaguar paint. Of course, Gran Turismo changing it to what, Castrol, I think, instead of having the cigarette sponsors. But yeah, beautiful shape, stunning engine. One of the biggest engines in a Group C car as well, if I recall correctly, like a 7-litre V12. What a beast. Next up, it's great to see it. It was on my list. One of my favourites of the whole series and one of my favourite brands, the Panos. And it's kind of wild that you can just say the Panos because we've still only ever had one of them in the whole franchise. But hey, at least it's been consistent. It was the same Panos every single time, even the same livery pretty much. But yeah, it was good to see that one also. The next one was eyebrow raising for me because I didn't realise this many people love this car. The Blitz Skyline. The drift spec, the ER34 four-door Skyline. I had no idea so many people seem to love this thing. I personally found it fascinating as a kid when I first realised that it had underglow neon. Next up, this one reminds me of my pick of the Marcos, which was lovely to see, the Ginetta. I'm surprised that anyone mentioned the Ginetta. This is definitely one of the cars I missed from Gran Turismo 5. I of course reviewed it, much like the Jensen Interceptor, one of the cars which was inexplicably left behind, and such a shame, because yeah, the Ginetta is such a fun little car. Next up, we've got a legend. Doesn't surprise me at all that it would be on the list. One of the most legendary super saloons, and here in the UK, many people who grew up through a certain era will have this as one of their favourites, the Lotus Carlton. Of course, legendary car. Evo magazine, I think, called it the Millennium Falcon of saloon cars. It's just, I think that's the best way of putting it, because not only is it ridiculously fast, but it does have that level of like pop culture nostalgia amongst petrol heads, like the Millennium Falcon does in the world of movies. It's such an iconic car. It's nothing like a Carlton, but it starts with a C at least. Dodge Charger. The classic Dodge Charger. Of course, who doesn't love a Dodge Charger? More recently, of course, I talked about the removal of liveries. If you put the Dukes of Hazzard stuff on it in Gran Turismo, and technically is a slightly different version of the Charger that we have now to what we used to have. My favourite version was actually the 71 Super B, but yeah, any Charger, you're pretty much good to go. They're damn good cars. The next one is not undervalued, it's definitely loved, and I feel like for some of you, you might be mentioning this because I talked about it not too long ago. It might have jogged your memory, or at least brought it to the front of your mind more. The Lamborghini LP670 SV. This one I think does have a good chance of coming back. I said as much in the review, that was the whole point of the video. But yeah, I mean, like the Aventador, it's just one of those cars. It's just such a fan favourite. Next up, a car which was mentioned more times than I would have thought, and I'm really happy about that because it's a badass car. It was on the short list for mine, but didn't quite make the end list because I just didn't use it as much as you'd have thought. And I believe, much like the XJR15, it handles like absolute garbage in real life as well. The Ford GT90. Wild blue interior with the floating spoiler. It's, yeah, super iconic for Gran Turismo 2 players, but I feel like for the rest of the franchise, many players are probably like, okay, because you kind of had to be there. It's one of those cars. I'm consolidating the next one again from a few different versions. Some people like the road car, some people love the race car. Again, my old man used to go back over and over again to using this one. He loved the handling on it. The M3 GTR, the BMW M3, with again those tinted lights, that iconic white with the blue checkered flag paint. And I feel like again some people might be mentioning this because of a certain need for speed entry, perhaps as well. But whichever the reason is, it is a very good car. The road car I think is wildly overrated. And there I said it, it's so expensive for what it is in real life, but the race car is legitimately great. It's a wonderful car to use, and of course in Most Wanted it's ridiculously OP and super iconic. The next one actually surprised me because it wasn't mentioned as much as I would have thought. It was mentioned enough to put it here, but I thought this would have been up there with the Lexus LFA, and it actually isn't. Maybe it's because not as many people have played Gran Turismo 7, maybe it's because it requires an invitation, which is one of the dumbest things in the game. The Porsche Carrera GT, one of the holy grail supercars for us to want for so long, and now that we finally have it, I'm amazed that more people didn't say it. Maybe some people are disappointed by how it sounds, how it drives, the fact that it costs so much maybe, or probably that you just don't have it because you haven't had the invite, but for whatever reason, I really would have thought that one would have popped up a lot more. The next one is definitely a case of consolidating so many different cars into one because there are so many to choose from in every single Gran Turismo game. Race car, road car. I don't think we've ever had rally versions, we've had touring car versions I think, we've certainly had aftermarket versions. The Honda Civic. So many to choose from, and so many people did choose different versions. EK, EP, so many road cars, so many race cars, Mugans, Spoons all over the place. It's a very versatile platform. I've driven a couple of Civics and I was lukewarm on them, but they were slightly newer ones, the FD2, the FN2. Of course I want to drive an EK, and potentially I think it's the EP, the earlier 2000s one, because I hear good things about those. But I'd be interested to see in future how the other older Civics stack up to my experience with the newer. But yeah, so many players mentioned the Civic. The next one also didn't surprise me at all because it's the RX-7. Many people brought up the REM Amir, the Aspara-Drink racing version in particular. Again, that doesn't surprise me. The RX-7 is just another one of those Mount Rushmore cars, I think, for Gran Turismo. Just such a consistently capable, good all-rounder. It's a fantastic road-going sports car. I personally really love the old-school RX-7, the FB, I think it is, like the OG pop-up headlight, tiny little version, which isn't that powerful. Unless I'm mistaken, Gran Turismo 2, I believe, did have this car. The next one wasn't mentioned quite as often as I would have thought, definitely not mentioned as often as any of the other Group C's, but it is pretty iconic, and for good reason, the Sauber, the Mercedes Sauber C9. The next one, I mentioned it way earlier on in this extremely long video, the GT40. Another Mount Rushmore car for sure. Mount Rushmore's getting a bit too big at the moment, but I think you'll probably agree that many of these kind of do have to be there. The GT40 certainly does. So iconic for that livery alone. Legitimate legend. You know, it's not just an overhyped car, it really was that level in terms of achieving that kind of success, being that fast, that gorgeous, that fantastic to listen to, just across the board. Of course, I was happy to see this one here. You're probably surprised if you know me that it wasn't mentioned earlier. My favourite car of the entire franchise, and for some of you it was too, and that's great to see. The Renault Espace F1. I'm not going to mention it anymore because I've talked about it already, but yeah, what an extreme machine. Another consistent one in LM race car form, in road car form. We only have the one to work with at the moment in GT7, but it's still a good one, the Mazda RX-8. It's easy to overlook it in favour of the RX-7, but the RX-8 is a very, very undervalued and very, very good car. I haven't driven one yet in real life, but I really would like to. Another JDM car which I saw consistent love for in a couple of different forms. Some people love the wagon, some people love the B4, the Subaru Legacy. This was a fun one to see because a lot of people go for stuff like the wagon, the 22B, you know, the usual Impreza stuff, but the Legacy is sometimes more easy to overlook. It's a bit more of the more sensible grown-up brother, kind of like the Legnum or the Galantis from Mitsubishi, but yeah, that was fun to see mentioned a number of times here by a few different people. This next one actually really pleasantly surprised me because it's such a recent addition. I mean, it's probably months and months ago now, but in relation to many of these other icons, the Dodge Demon. This is, talk about fresh metal. This has not been in Gran Turismo for very long, and it's so cool to see that so many of you legitimately love this car. That's really cool. I remember I adored the Dodge Challenger when it was in that initial concept form. I love how faithful to the concept the road version was, the SRT8, and of course it's gone from strength to strength in terms of crazy power, with the Demon being one of the best examples. Sticking on the topic of American metal though, this one was wonderful to see because it's another one of the most undervalued concept cars in my opinion, but clearly not because some of you love it as well. And talk about a speed machine, the Cadillac Cian. Beautiful car. For me, it's definitely overshadowed, in real life at least, by my favourite concept car of all time, Cadillac's own 16, but the Cian is a beast. I think it's such a shame that it never reached production. If the Saleen S7 could have been America's McLaren F1, you could argue that it is pretty much, then I would argue that the Cian could have been America's Zonda. It's that kind of big capacity, naturally aspirated V12, angled, gothic, sharp, wild supercar. We don't have to consolidate the next one quite as much because there aren't as many versions to choose from, but the Cobra. Another one which I said, of course, on my list, I believe it to be the most beautiful car of all time in Daytona Cobra form. Some people mention road versions, some people mention Daytona, so again I won't talk about it for too long, but yeah, definitely deserves to be here, and it's good to see that it was. Another ugly duckling, if you will, like the Leicester Storm or the Panos, not physically speaking, but in terms of not quite fitting in. This one was fun because it seems like a lot of people love this one, I would assume, for probably nationalistic reasons. I would assume that many of you probably love this as Aussies. The Tickford, as I often call it, the Ford Falcon XR8. The only V8 supercar that Gran Turismo has ever had, which is kind of insane when you think about that as, what, 25 years or something or more at this point of the game being around. It's kind of wild that we've still only had one of these, but there you go. Another consistent pair of JDMs coming up. First up, Mitsubishi 3000 GT and or the GTO. Many people who are OG players love the LM race car, and of course the road car is extremely versatile as well. I mean, now you can throw an Escudo engine into that thing, so you could argue even more than ever, I guess. And the next one, I mean, if there were a Mount Rushmore in Gran Turismo just of normal quote-unquote cars, and certainly if you were talking about cars which I am sure many people who bought it because of growing up on Gran Turismo, the Mazda Miata, the MX-5. And in particular, I'm assuming many people are referring to the older ones. So much love for the Miata and for the MX-5, I guarantee, came from Gran Turismo roots. Just like the other expected picks, this one won't surprise anyone, but I'm going to split this one into kind of two in one, which isn't really fair, but I'm going to do it anyway. The Chaparral pair. I call it the Chaparral pair because, well, we don't have it anymore, but it was easy to overlook one for the other. The 2J is obvious, of course, one of my favourite cars. The 2D, though, got a bit of love. Not as much as I would have hoped, but it definitely got some love from different players, and that's great to see, because it was always overshadowed by the 2J in pretty much every way, but it was a legitimately lovely little car to drive, and it's a great looking machine as well. The next one, of course, you have to go super wide on this one, much like with the Civic, because there's so many different versions that people love, be it rally, be it road, be it aftermarket. Mitsubishi Evo. I know that's way too broad to just say as one thing, but we're going to have to say it as one thing because there's so much under that banner of just the Evo. Another one which you could probably whittle down, at least from what I saw, to maybe two in particular, was Roof. And it was cool to see a lot of love for Roof. Not really the CTR3 though, unfortunately, in the later games, but the CTR2 in particular, and of course the Yellowbird. I seem to recall the Yellowbird is due to come back. I think Gran Turismo and Roof have been a partnership that's been so much longer standing than Gran Turismo and Porsche, and you can tell by how much favour Porsche gets now that it's what Kaz wanted the whole time. Maybe it was too expensive or whatever, but having Roof in there, you could always tell it was only because they couldn't quite get Porsche, and now that he can, he loves them. Next one was mentioned in a bunch of different forms. I'm going to call it the Lamborghini Diablo as an overarching thing. Some people love the GT1, some people love the GT, the road version, but yeah, not a huge amount of love, but it was definitely there. Speaking of something which had more love than I would have thought though, the Nardo, the Volkswagen W12. That's really great to see. I loved that supercar. Again, I've got a model of that one next to me as well. I think it's such a shame that that one will never reach production, and I've never loved that car more than in Test Drive Unlimited. I mean, that Roadster version is gorgeous, and the coupe version with that blue interior, the yellow body, it's such a beast of a car. I always thought it could have been like Germany's Celine S7 from a certain perspective. Sticking in this world of supercars that we're talking about though, the next one definitely falls into that group as well, a more recent addition again. Well, actually not a recent addition, but a recent return, I should say. Definitely a long-standing tradition of having it in LM race car and certainly road car form, the XJ220. Of course, many people here in the UK have this as their favourite supercar, especially of course if you grew up through that era, and it was the fastest car in the world for a very short time, so yeah, and technically it won Le Mans in its class, but then I think they took the victory away for it having too large of a fuel tank or something like that. But yeah, absolute legend of a car. And if saying Pagani Huayra didn't scream to me that you like Gran Turismo 6, then this one sure as hell does, because a few people mentioned the Alpha TZ3, and anyone who uses an Alpha TZ3 knows exactly what the TZ3 is good for. I barely saw anyone using it as a road car, let's put it that way. This thing on Special Stage Route X was like the first car that people noticed just how stupidly quick it was. Before the Veyron, before the Huayra, before even the GTR Nismo, there was the TZ3, and it was stupidly quick. The next one is lovely to see so much love for, and this one, as soon as you tell me that you love this car, I immediately know that you're the kind of person who used to do a lot of seasonal events in Gran Turismo 6, the Suzuki GSX-R 4 Concept. Powered by a motorcycle engine, I guess you could say this car kind of lives on in spirit by having some other vehicles like this, like the Honda Project 2 and 4, but having this one back I think would make a lot of people happy, and it would be very OP still, I think. The next two stick in the world of Le Mans once again in a general sense. The BMW V12 LMR, first of all, such an iconic car. I didn't use this one as much as you would think for someone who has my kind of eclectic tastes back when it was first introduced in Gran Turismo 4, and I think it was probably because it wasn't quite as powerful as some of the others, but respect where it's due, another very big engine for a Le Mans car, 6-litre V12, and of course a Le Mans winner in 1999, and a beautiful car as well. Speaking of beautiful, and certainly a car which was the exact opposite to the Beamer, if I didn't use the Beamer enough, then you could definitely accuse me of using this one too much. Let's call this a 3-in-1, because some people love the hybrid, some people love the Courage. That was my go-to with the PlayStation ice cream livery, as I used to call it, and even the very undervalued Peugeot version in the blue and green Pescarolo. I mean, talk about OP. These were like the OPest of OP in Gran Turismo 4, just burst onto the scene out of nowhere and destroyed everything in its path. The Courage in particular, or as it was later renamed the GV5, with that Judd V10 engine, what a beast. And then the hybrid came along and blew everything out of the water. Like, nothing could virtually keep up with that as an all-rounder. Some could keep up with it through corners, some could keep up in a straight line for top speed, but that one had such a blend of both, it was a formidable machine. We're jumping back way down the food chain on performance though again, to more realistic stuff, because there was a lot of love for the next two. First of all, the Honda Del Sol. I remember a buddy of mine really wanted the Del Sol. He also wanted a CRX when he was growing up. I don't think he ever ended up having either, but a lot of, again, love for these kind of things comes from Gran Turismo. Likewise with the next one. Quite a few people said either Lexus IS200 or IS300, or certainly Toyota Altezza. Some mentioned the road version, some mentioned aftermarket versions, and certainly some mentioned the touring car, which was a great looking car. The next one reminds me of the Venturi thing, because Vector popped up a few times as well. Great again to see some love for a variety of different Vectors. I didn't notice as much love for the race car, which surprises me actually, because it was definitely the most useful of the three, but yeah, I love Vector. This next one, I think for some people will probably be too broad for me to put together, so I'll mention a few different names, because I'm going to say Lotus as a broad term, because many people, that was the vibe I got from what you were saying. Like, it's not even about any one specific Lotus, you just really miss Lotus and you really want them back. So some people mentioned Esprit, some mentioned Elise, some mentioned Europa, and of course all of those have the potential. Some said Evora, if I recall correctly, and of course I talked about the Carlton earlier on. For me, of course, it would be the Elise GT1 or the Esprit GT1, but there are so many Lotus models, and this just goes to show there is so much that Lotus had to offer, and you notice that now that they're not here. Another one which was great to see the consistent love for, not as strong as some of the others in this category, certainly not on the level of like a GT1 or a Speed 8, but the Peugeot 905. I do actually think that this one has a decent chance of coming back, and it would be a wild one to bring back, because like the GT1, it would be the first time it ever has that detailed interior. This is a two-time Le Mans winning car in 92 and 93, and what's even wilder, it did it right after the 787B1 in 91. I mean, talk about a hell of a 3 years. This was right when Formula One started to bleed fully into Le Mans technology with that screaming V10 engine, and really the only downside to the Peugeot 905 was that the gear changes were so sluggish. It took so long to change gear, but in Forza that was never an issue, and the results were clear. It was one of the most OP cars in the game back in like Forza 4. Another one which popped up quite a number of times was the Nismo 400R. I'm guessing those people must be really happy because it's now back, of course. Used to be in the franchise. It was a great car, but now it's way more expensive than it ever used to be, and I feel like some people might love it because of experiencing it now in GT7, perhaps for the first time. So I'd be curious to know which camp you fall into, if that was one of your picks. Another one which has, of course, returned, immediately iconic silhouette, and that's in the name, the R30, the Skyline Super Silhouette. Personally, I don't find it to be quite useful enough to use in Group 3, at least with balance of performance, but yeah, hell of a machine, looks awesome. It's definitely not as OP as it was in Gran Turismo 2, where it was pretty damn great to drive, but yeah, it's still fantastic to see it back, and kind of surprising. If you take a step back and think, that's actually Gran Turismo 7, that's kind of wild to me. Another pick which I'm going to have to consolidate a bit, because some people mention the Junior, some mention the X2010, some mention the X2011, of course I'm referring to Red Bull. This one I feel like might be a controversial pick for some people because it's borderline like Vision GT stuff, but unlike the Tomahawk and some others, this one feels like it has a bit more of like a Gran Turismo originality to it. It feels like, as I said about the Mazda LM55, it's like they did put genuine effort in because they wanted the players to really enjoy this insane car. And of course I love the idea behind it, especially in that original X2010 form, because taking essentially a Chaparral 2J and combining it with LMP tech and Formula tech to make just an ultimate no-holds-barred ridiculous race car. Well, of course I'm going to love that. And it actually lived up to it because years later, it's still one of the quickest cars of the whole franchise. If you were to bring an X2010 or X2011 back now and make it as quick as it used to be, it would blow the doors off of pretty much everything in the game. The next one I'm going to mention in more of a kind of passing sense, because we talked about the wagon earlier on, there's a lot of love for the Impreza, which isn't surprising, much like the Evo, but a lot of people seem to say the rally car was one of their favourites. Some different variations of the rally car, but the rally car in a general sense. And of course, yeah, such an iconic car from Gran Turismo as well. And even though there were one or two others mentioned here or there, perhaps even on some occasions mentioned a couple of times, that was the ones which I saw the most consistently, the most support for, the most engagement with, the most times mentioned by different people. So a broad list, I'm going to have to tally up and see how many that was, because I didn't even count off the top of my head, but yeah, it's a hell of a list. Many of them are exactly the kind of cars that you would expect, and some of them, as I said, working through it, definitely weren't. But yeah, if you saw yours on the list, then it must be great to know that you're not the only one who feels that way, and I think it was a fun little exercise to see, even in this relatively small pocket of the Gran Turismo community, just how many of these cars have such a fervent love. And it's wild to me how you can, in the same list and in the same fandom, have something that is as different as seeing one person say a Challenger Demon, which is such a fresh face, and then a few comments later you'll see someone, and this was a suggestion, it wasn't in the list because only one person said it, but someone actually said that their favourite car was the Mercedes C43 AMG, which was only in Gran Turismo 2. Talk about a deep cut pick. I love how varied, how eclectic that is. just like my taste is in Gran Turismo as well, but it was a fun exercise, something again to be more positive about Gran Turismo, because there are plenty of things to complain about, but it doesn't mean that you can't think about the stuff that you did enjoy, and it's also quite interesting to see how many of those are more recent additions, which is a good sign. It means that people aren't done with the franchise, because we shouldn't be. We do want it to address some of the things that need addressing, but also recognise that there is a lot which we can enjoy, and that's great to see. It's a hell of a long video. If you joined me for the whole ride, then thanks for that. I'm sure you were watching it on 2x speed or had something else to do in the meantime, and I am considering some other ideas as well in this kind of community engagement video where we pose a topic and then come back to it later on, so stick around for those, and of course stick around for more Gran Turismo news in general in future. But now I'm going to go and get a drink, because I've been stood here recording the whole thing in one go, and I'll see you next time. But for now, thanks for watching.